ER diagrams are important for modeling the database. Basically, they are used for providing a visual representation of the relationship between the entities and the attributes and how they interact. So, there are some commonly used symbols which are used for representing the ER diagrams. We should understand these symbols first before we try to represent the ER diagrams. So, first one is the entities. Basically, we represent an entity using a rectangle. For example, here you can see that we use the rectangle symbol to represent an entity. Suppose I have a entity called student, and this entity, the student entity, has the attributes. Namely, we can know that every student has an ID, then he has a name, then he has his CGPA. So, suppose for example, take some of the roll numbers as 101. So these are the IDs of the students, their names. It is possible that two students can have the same name, whereas their IDs will be usually distinct. Similarly, the CG can also match. So how to represent this entity is that we take a square rectangle, then the student has some attributes which are used using ellipses. You can see that there is an ellipse for representing their attributes. So student has an ID, then he has a name, then he has a CGPA. Since the student ID, the student ID student ID is usually unique for every student and it cannot be null. So it is called as the super key or the primary key, not the super key. It's called as the primary key, and we put a underline to indicate that this particular attribute is the primary key for this entity. So primary keys are indicated by a uh, underline. Okay, so here it is. If an attribute has an underline, then it means it's the primary key. And if an attribute has a double oval, then it's called as a multi-valued attribute. So once again, I'm telling every entity is represented using a square, then an attribute is represented using an oval. If the attribute has an underline, then it means it's the primary key. And if the attribute has a double oval, it's called as a multi-valued attribute. What does it mean? Suppose, for example, take another attribute in this table called the email ID of the student. Sorry, student's email ID. We all know that it is possible that a student can have multiple email IDs. For example, the first student, he may have one, two, three mail IDs. Second student can have only two mail IDs, and so on. So every student can have multiple email IDs. It's not that he has only a single, maybe his university email ID and personal email ID. So it's possible that they may have multiple email. So it is no longer a single value, rather this attribute is a multi-value. So how we represent it? We use a double oval shape to indicate that this attribute is a multi-valued attribute. So I think entities and their attributes, the different types of attributes are clear. Now I discussed discriminator key. A discriminator key is one for a weak entity. So what is a weak entity? A weak entity is an entity which does not have a primary key. It does not have a primary key. For example, sorry, take for example the books borrowed in a library. Books borrowed in a library. So we can have, for example, name of the book and date of borrow. So same books can be issued on the same date as well. Uh, so even on the same day, same books can be issued. So you can see that there is no primary key for this kind of data. So in this case, we cannot tell that this entity has a primary key. That's why this entity is called as a weak entity. What is a weak entity? Weak entity is basically an entity which does not have a primary key. By itself, it does not have any primary key. Rather, it has a discriminator key. What is a discriminator key? A discriminator key, for example, in this case, can be the name. How is it a discriminator key? This discriminator key can be associated with a primary key of another entity so that every record becomes unique. I'll explain with an example. But basically, just understand that first of all, what a weak entity is. Weak entity is something which does not have any. Uh, this is a weak entity. Weak entity itself does not have any primary key. So how we represent a weak entity? We can represent using a double rectangle. Okay, so a weak entity has a discriminator key, not a primary key, which can be combined with the primary key of another strong entity. So this books is a weak entity which will represent using a double rectangle. It has two attributes. One is the name of the book, the other is the date of borrow date. Okay. Since it's a weak entity, we use a discriminator key which has a dotted line, unlike the primary key which has a solid line. Okay. No. So basically there are two types of entities, strong entity, weak entity. Then there are different types of attributes that we have discussed, like a normal attribute, the multi-valued attribute, a primary key, and a discriminator key. Now, what is a relationship? Relationship exists between two entities. Take for example, uh, an employee entity, an employee entity he works he works for a department. An employee entity works for a department. We'll get into the types of relationships later on, but first understand that there is a relationship between the employee entity and the department entity. The employee entity has some attributes like the employee ID, his name, and the salary. And he works for a department which itself has a department ID. Then it has a name of the department. If you want any other attribute like the location and all, or total number of employees, you can add for it. So every employee entity works for a department. So this this line indicates the link between an entity and another entity, or between a entity and an attribute. Now, uh, a single line indicates a partial participation, whereas a double line indicates a complete uh, or a total participation in the relationship. For example, if I put a double line, it indicates that every record in the employee or every employee has has to work in some department. Every employee, whoever has an ID, or every employee in this employee table has to work in a department. He has to associate it. He has to be associated with a department. So this indicates, when we write a double arrow, it indicates a complete participation of every record in the employee table. Whereas if you put a single line, sorry, if you put a single line instead of a double line, it indicates a partial participation. Maybe I'll take one more example to explain this. So let me take, for example, if the employee has the following records. Employee has the following records where there is an ID, the name, and the salary. And I have the department table. The department has a department ID and it has a name. So let me take the employee ID as 101, 102, 103, 104, and the department as 1, 2, 3, 4. One is sales, second is HR, and then third is production, and fourth is social media. Okay, so let the name be B, A, C, then the salary, some numbers, 2.3K or 3.8K, 4.4K, and 8K. Now I'll put another table to show the relationship between employee ID and the department. So this ID belongs to the employee table, whereas this ID belongs to the department. So 101 he works for 1, 102 and 103 both work for uh, production department, and 104 he works for the HR. So as of now, you see that all the records from the employee table, that is 101, 102, 103 and 104. So all the records from the employee table have some ID associated with the department. So it's a complete participation of the employee, of the entity employee. However, from the department table, we can see that the social media, there is no employee who is mapped to the social media department. Currently, in this relationship, there is nobody associated with the social media department. So this relationship, it's a partial relationship or partial participation, whereas this entity is in a complete participation in this relationship. Okay. Now coming to strong entity and weak entity once again, just like I have mentioned about the example of the student borrows books. So I'll represent this. So I have this, uh, the student, every student, maybe I'll go down. Every student, he has an ID, a name, and sorry, and the CGP. So this student is in a relationship that he uh, borrows the books from the library. He borrows books from the library. As I mentioned, books is a weak entity because it doesn't have any primary key associated with it. So it just has only the uh, discriminator key where the name of the book and the date of borrowing. Now, one important thing is that when we uh, when we represent a relationship between a strong entity and a weak entity, instead of using a single diamond shaped box, we use a double diamond shaped box. So this kind of box, a double shaped box, indicates relationship between a strong entity and a weak entity. Strong and weak entity. So for example, I'll just take an example that with some records, I'll just take an example. Take for example the student. There are four students. ID, the name, and the CG. ID is 101, 2, 3, and 104. Name CG is. Now I have books. What are the books having? The books has some names and date of borrowing. Date of borrowing the book. Okay. So I have basically the name of the book as A, AC and AD. Now suppose if a date, if a book is borrowed, it means some student must have borrowed it. So it always has to be associated with some student. So this participation will always be complete. For a weak entity, the participation is always complete in the relationship with a strong entity. Okay, because if a book is borrowed, it means that some student must have borrowed it. So we have to in the borrow table, what all will we associate? We'll associate the ID of the student and the name of the book. Now I think it's clear why we call the name as the discriminator key, because in a relationship it is associated with the primary key of the strong entity. So student 101, he has a borrowed A, 102 has borrowed another same book on the same day, whatever, and 103 has borrowed AC and 104 has borrowed AD. So you can see that all the entities, or sorry, all the records in the books table are associated with some student. So this participation is complete. Whereas this may not always be complete, it can be partial also. Suppose if I have another student, 105D, CGS 6.8, he did not issue any book. It is possible that he did not issue any book. So this relationship can be partial, whereas this is always a complete relationship.